I don't know about all that stuff, but we're going to talk about finance. So the commissioner's right about one thing. When a little over a year ago, I was starting to transition from superintendency to this current job, and I thought probably it was really good timing. And now I'm not really so sure it was the best timing. But anyhow, when you get right down to it, it really is interesting times for us, and we know that. In addition to all you're doing in responding to the public health issues and keeping your school instruction going at the highest possible level, we all have all these extra layers of funding issues that go with that. And so they're truly unique times that we're working our way through that. If I would have told you a year ago that we would have finished the year with a huge budget surplus in the state and that we'd have another roughly $3 billion coming to education for relief, nobody in here would have believed that, right? None of us. But that is our reality, and I appreciate your efforts to keep all those balls in the air, juggling them as you go through the year. A lot of different activities going on that are truly unique to the times, and I appreciate your patience and perseverance in seeing that through. And I'm really proud of our team, Dr. Neal and the entire school finance team, the federal programs teams, for their efforts to try to help support you through that process along with our entire DESE team. We'll start with a little budget update looking overall, and we finished last year at a very strong position statewide. Overall revenues were up 25% over the prior year. Now obviously that has a lot to do with the timing of the FY20 tax returns being pushed into FY21. But even if you account for that, there's about $780 million there that if you push back into FY20 and did that same comparison, we still have a growth of over $700 million. So very strong cash position, which has helped alleviate some of the concerns. And at this time last year, we had significant budget restrictions that were in place at the same time because of all the uncertainty. We didn't know what was going to happen. Well, fortunately, as the year went along, those funds were released and we finished in an overall fairly good position. And looking at some of the formula factors, we ended up paying out the full SAT last year. The SAT is $63.75 again for this year. The dollar value modifier adjusts each year, so you're welcome to go look that up and double check that, but it should be reflected in your payments. And then the threshold percentages, we're in year 2 of the current recalculation. And so as we move into another year and we start thinking about budgeting for the future, we are to the point in time where we're going to have to recalculate the SAT, so that process is underway now. Now, since we don't have 2019 or 2020 APRs, we had to come up with some alternate methodology to identify performance districts. We're going through that process now, so we'll later this fall be able to update you on where we're at in terms of the SAT for next year. We paid out at 6302 for the month of July, but that's early in the year. We fully expect that to go to 6375 by the end of the year. But we can't say that for sure. You just have to watch all of our different revenue streams through the course of the year to see if in fact we can achieve that. One important thing I want to bring to your attention is something I mentioned last year at this time, and that is we have a special provision in our statutes that talks about adjusting our payments under a pandemic situation like we have now. I didn't know that provision was there until I got to the department. We started doing some research, we came across this. And basically what that means for your Prop C Classroom Trust Fund, Small Schools Grant this year, we will use the highest of your 1920 or 2021 ADA or weighted ADA for those calculation purposes. So last year's lower attendance, if that was the situation in your district, will not impact you for those payment situations. So that provision was not reflected in the July payment. We have to go through the Office of Administration to get our programming done for the payment system. We're waiting on them to complete that work, but hopefully by August or September we'll be up to date, and your year to date at that point in time will be accurate. So we will automatically use the better of 19 or 20 for that calculation purpose. You won't have to do anything at your level. Classroom Trust Fund, I just want to remind you that that is embedded within the formula. It's a separate revenue stream in your payment, but it is part of the overall formula calculation. Right now, I know a lot of people are looking at that and paying attention to that because you're looking with all these extra relief funds, different ways to try to get money into capital projects for certain things. Classroom Trust Fund is one of those things you can put into capital projects. You can put it in any fund you want. with the exception of anything that's an increase since 2009, 2010 has to remain in your operating funds, Fund 1 or Fund 2. So just wanted to remind you of that. At the end of the year last year, for last fiscal year, Classroom Trust Fund really did much better than I think most people thought it would do. We ended up with $337 million, which that's $16 million less than appropriation, but way more than I thought it would have been when this process started. That figures out to about $415 per ADA. So overall, we were short there, but the fact that we had smaller summer school in 2020 allowed the formula to still be fully funded. So that interplay between Classroom Trust Fund gaming monies and ADA really all plays together to determine whether or not we make it to 6375 at the end of the year or not. For FY22, the assumed revenue number was slightly less at $350 million in the appropriation. Again, we will automatically use the higher of your 2020 or 2021 ADA. And when we do that, the reality is the total ADA in that calculation is likely to actually go up a little bit over what it was last year. So right now that would translate to about 422 per ADA, but again, who knows if we'll get to the full Classroom Trust Fund appropriation. Very seldom do we do that. And for each $10 million we're short, that dollar amount adjusts by about $12. Piece of bright news, obviously, for our economy, and I think the governor's really proud of this too, is that our economy's continued to move with all the extra funds that are flowing, relief funds and otherwise. Sales taxes remain really strong. Last year, we were able to distribute the entire appropriation, which doesn't happen all that often either, the full $958.4 million. That translated to nearly $1,048 per weighted ADA. We actually had slightly more cash than that. They got carried over into this fiscal year, so that's a really good position for us. And we look at this year, the assumed appropriation is the same dollar figure. Again, we're going to use automatically the higher of your 2020 or 2021 weighted ADA for the calculation. It's somewhere in that neighborhood of $1,048 at the appropriated level. If in fact we see that the revenues are continuing to remain strong and we're on pace to outgrow that number, we can ask for a supplemental appropriation. I think that's happened once in my career that I can remember, where we had to have a supplemental appropriation in Prop C to get all the funds out by the end of the year. So every $10 million of variance there translates to about $11 per weighted ADA. So if we end up with $10 million more, you could add $11 to that 1,048. Governor mentioned an extra $20 million for transportation. That's really good news, and I know most of you are aware that that's kind of tied to some other legislation, but I think that's good that we have that extra funding in there and available to us. But it's really hard to predict what your individual district impact might be from the formula, because the variables are really unique this year in terms of ridership and miles because of the different levels of service across the state. We are a couple months away from a live transportation payment, so you'll have a better sense of that when we get to September and we have better ASBR data that we can use to generate a live payment. On our website, we've got a lot of different budget information tools there. I just wanted to kind of mention there, I do encourage you to keep reading the memo every month. It's going to have information, and you see a lot of things that repeat from month to month, but there's almost always something new and hopefully beneficial for you in that information. The last item there is the tax auditor's office tax rate calculation information. Obviously, many of you are in that process right now of establishing your tax rates and going through that process. I know Massa and Moasbo have the workshop afterwards. I see Jason over there, and Jim Cummins will be doing that in Granada A immediately after this conference. If you're interested in attending that and didn't sign up in advance, I know they'll take walk-ins today, so I wanted to invite you to do that if you think it'll be beneficial. I know the Blankenship decision is impacting a lot of districts this year in terms of your tax rate, and you're working your way through that. And I just want you to know that's nobody's fault. That's just how the statute was interpreted at the time based on the language there, and a judge determined that a piece of that was not constitutional. It's unfortunate, but I don't think anybody did anything wrong, and if you have a community member that's telling you they think you did something wrong in that regard, don't hesitate to ask for my assistance or input. I'll be glad to help clear the record, so to speak. All right, transitioning then to federal relief funds. I know I know this is an extra layer of complication to all the work that you're doing right now, trying to work through that. And I'll be honest with you, the timing and the federal requirements for these ARP funds doesn't really match our work that we're doing right now. You should be focused on getting school started, but we know you have to focus on this ARP plan as well. So let's talk a little bit globally first. We're in the process of distributing several layers of the funding. The big buckets are in this chart. It may be hard to see for you, but we're about 93% in terms of getting the ESSER 3 funds out. Different amounts of different targeted grants. The governor prioritized student connectivity early on with GEAR funds, as well as transportation, extra resources early on. So we need to continue to draw that down. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. ESSER 2, you've drawn nearly 30% of that already. So we got a supplemental appropriation for that in late May, and you've put that to use to your benefit. And then within the ARP funds, we've got more to come that we'll talk about in more detail here. Quick reminder on the Connectivity Connections Grant. At this point, we're coming up close to the September 30 deadline for that funding. And as I mentioned, quite a bit of those funds have gone out, but we've got a lot of LEAs that are have eligibility here that haven't requested those funds. My hope is over the course of the summer, you've been purchasing additional devices that qualify that could use these funds, and you're going to turn in those payment requests in the near future. But we get to September 30th and we don't have all those funds utilized, we will start a process for reallocation. And the same thing holds true for the transportation supplement. I'm hopeful that some of you use those funds for your summer school transportation program, and you're going to claim those reimbursements. But again, after September 30th this fall, we will start a reallocation process. We managed all those through EPEGs, both the transportation and the connectivity. If you are completed with all your expenditures there, your final expenditure report can be completed for those. Another reminder regarding those transportation funds, if you utilize relief funds for transportation, that is an allowable expense under ESSER and GEAR, especially when we're talking in this case about summer school transportation, or if you want to continue on during the school year and do transportation for a tutoring program or some after-school program, it's ESSER eligible. But if you use either ESSER or GEAR for any of those transportation expenses, you have to code those expenditures to 2558 so they don't get picked up in the transportation formula, and you exclude those miles from your ASBR reporting. Transitioning now, teacher recruitment and retention. Hopefully you had an opportunity to watch Paul's video about that grant program. I'm just going to touch on it at a high level today, but it's really a focused investment of our ESSER reserve funds. Your allocation of ESSER is 90% of the funds. The state has a reserve of up to 10% of the total state ESSER funds, and this is one place where we've invested these funds. And so the $50 million grant program does not come out of any of your regular allocations. We created a separate allocation for that to support Grow Your Own and a variety of retention strategies. The thinking process here is obviously we have both a long-term and a short-term challenge for us in this effort. I know we've heard over and over again about the challenges of hiring staff right now. And so we need both a long and a short strategy. The long strategy is we need more people in the pipeline. We know the pay issues out there. We can't fix that with these ESSER funds, but we can address some of the other things that might contribute to getting more people in the pipeline and keeping more people in the educator pipeline. If we just get 3 or 4 kids out of each high school each year to get into the education preparation programs, we'd add 2,000 teachers each year to our network. Likewise, if we can do strategies that will convince folks to stay in the field, once they get in the field, we could add many more teachers as well, retain many more teachers as well. The evidence is clear. Less than half of our teachers are there by year 6. They've left the profession for one reason or another. Some for good reasons, and others just because we haven't been able to support them in a way to get them to be career educators in one way or another. Paul's put together some strategies that's within the grant program that we can use to try to retain our existing staff, and roughly $40 million of the $50 million is on retention-focused efforts, and that's money you can put into the pockets and or invest in your educator team at your local level. Timeline-wise, we got the allocations out in May. You may be wondering why the allocations came first and everything else came much later. Quite frankly, we're planning to use ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3 funds for that, and we had a commitment date in May for our ESSER 1 funds, so that's why we went ahead and did the allocations at that time. July 1st, the guidance came out. The applications are hopefully going to open by the end of this week or soon thereafter, and then you have until January to put together your application for these funds. And know that there is a specialist in the RPDC in your area that can help you with both your grow your own efforts and your use of these funds, your application process, all of that. You'll have somebody available to support you with this grant. That's part of the use of the funds that we're using to make the grant have the best implementation we can. Governor really talked about career and technical education and workforce development initiatives, and that's been a focus for the Gear 2 funds that are coming soon. We had a pretty good plan, we thought, in place early in the legislative session, but you may have noticed that there was language added to the bill, the appropriation bill, that talks about at least 50% of the funds have to go to parent reimbursements. So we are adjusting that and working on guidance. We will have a parent reimbursement grant for CTE-related expenses, such as IRCs, TSAs, articulated dual credit, things of that sort. So we will have an allocation process for that. We'll have allowable uses for that, and we will publish that information hopefully in the near future. There's a second pot within those Gear 2 funds for career center enhancements, for equipment enhancement grants. We are working on guidance for that programming as well, and we've had some communication with area career center directors, and we're working on finalizing that guidance. And then there's also a small pot of money that will go to the JAG programs that are located in alternative high school settings. That's been a priority of the governor, as you know, the JAG programs across the state, and we wanted to put a little more support towards some of those programs. There's another funding stream coming that we're aware of from the ARP funding, and it's for homeless children and youth. We're awaiting the appropriation for this, as we are all the ARP-related funds. However, this funding will be divided into two different grant programs. The first one, the ARP HCY1, $2.4 million, is going to be a competitive grant process that looks very similar to the homeless grants that are out there available to us through McKinney-Vento. The larger pot of money that's coming, the $7.2 million, is allocation-based. That's a combination of Title I methodology and a homeless count for each LEA. And so we're working on developing that allocation and setting that up for across the state. The guidance does require that the minimum award be at least $5,000. And once we do these allocations, we're going to find many of the LEAs in the state won't have that much of an award by themselves. And so what the guidance tells us is that school districts need to come together in consortiums, whether that's an existing consortium or a new consortium, to gather up enough allocation to have at least $5,000 in order to draw that grant program down. Again, we'll have more specific guidance available for you, but be thinking about who you might want to partner with if you're in a smaller district and you're not sure you would have the minimum $5,000 award. You may have a special ed co-op already, you may have some other regional group that you can work through, or you may just work with schools in your county or so forth to try to develop a consortium that draw down those funds. So more details to come on that. Just wanted to preview it briefly today, and again, it's subject to appropriation. Let's talk a little bit more detail then about ARP ESSER, or otherwise known as ESSER 3. Timeline there. We posted the allocations May 24th, and let me just say that the timeline seems pretty rigid for these funds. Those timeline benchmarks were established in the federal statute and regulations that go with these funds, so we didn't create these. These were kind of handed down to us, and so we're trying to work through that with you. Allocations posted in May. June 23rd was your deadline to post your safe return and to in-person instruction plan. July 23rd is when we opened the application. A few days before that, on July 20th, we posted a much more substantial guidance document. Hopefully you've seen that. It outlines everything you need to do. Back in May even, we kind of gave a framework of the safe return and the ARP ESSER plan requirements for you, so you would have that to be working on. But we're down to crunch time now. We're 3 weeks away from that deadline. Hopefully you've been doing the work behind the scenes to be ready for that. The challenge for us is obviously we've got this short-term deadline to get our application done, and then ultimately We're not sure when we're going to receive the funds, but we at least have a long time frame to spend those funds clear out to September of '24 with the tidings amendment. So I know you need, to really be focused on this at the same time you're trying to get school open, but it's not our timeline, it's the one we all need to follow just to make sure we access the majority of these funds. Now here's one of the most important takeaways for you. There's a few today, but here's one I want to make sure everybody's clear on. There are three essential elements to your ARP-ESSER plan. One is that safe return plan that you've already worked on. You've completed that with public input. You've got it posted on your website, hopefully. You're going to link it into your plan that you submit to us here in August. You're going to revisit that every 6 months or as needed to make sure it's up to date moving forward. So that's one piece of it. The second piece is your formal plan that's due on August 23rd. That plan is going to talk a little bit about how you're going to address mitigation. It's going to talk about how you're going to use the 20% reserve funds for lost instructional time and what research-based initiatives you're going to incorporate those funds with. So all those are included. And then the third piece of it is your ARP-ESSER budget that you do in EPEGS. So to be clear, you're used to doing an EPEGS budget, and for many of our grants that was enough. There wasn't a separate application. In this one, we have the ESSER plan that's going to be submitted via compliance plans. So an extra layer to this one that I need you to be attentive to. And then when it comes time for us to evaluate, you can go ahead and do the EPEGS budget piece anytime or in any order, but we're going to look at your regular plan first, and then we're going to review the EPEGS budget to make sure it matches your other plan and the details you have in that plan. So that's kind of the order of operation for that for us. Some of the other details, as we mentioned, we're due August 23rd. There's that 20% reserve requirement for lost instructional time. Those interventions that you select need to be evidence-based, and if it's not one that's already on the list, you'll have to cite the evidence that you're going to use. The remaining 80% are under that larger umbrella of allowable uses that you've been using for ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, so that long list of 15 or so allowable uses. I've had somebody ask me, can you do more than 20% on lost instructional time? Absolutely, that's just a minimum. Consultation is required prior to plan submission, so that's another area we get a lot of questions. Back when you did your safe return, you had to have public input. For this phase of the process, we're talking about consultation with staff, administrators, parents, any group of students in your district, whether they're with disabilities, English learners, homeless foster care. To the extent you have those in your communities, try to engage them through a consultation process, whether it's through existing structures or some other method that you want to do to try to get their input in terms of what their needs are as you identify those most significantly impacted by the COVID pandemic. Again, we're awaiting a spending authority. I've had a lot of people ask when we think that will happen. We have made the formal request through the budget and planning process to have that included within the next available supplemental, but we don't know for sure when that's going to happen. It could be as early as a September veto session type special session situation. It may be in January. There were some emergency bills in January. It could be well into the next legislative session. We just don't know at this point. Obviously, we're requesting and encouraging it to be as soon as possible. Another reminder that capital projects do require prior approval. And keep in mind, even though we don't know when the appropriation authority is available, it can go back to March of 2020. So it does have, you do have the ability for everything other than those capital projects to go backwards in terms of claiming expenditures. There's a new requirement in the ARP-ESSER for some districts to be considering, and that is the maintenance of equity requirement. Now, if you are less than 1,000 students in your district, you're excluded from this. If you serve all your students in an per grade level in a single building in your district, you're exempt from this. But to the extent you're over 1,000 students and you have multiple buildings at the same grade span, this does apply to you. We've already got a list of LEAs posted on our website under the ARP-ESSER 3 information where all your buildings are listed and ranked, and those top 25% from a poverty level are the buildings that you must maintain at least the same level of per pupil funding and the same student staff ratios very similar to what Title I comparability would be for you in your district for the similar kind of approach. And again, the email that came out prior to the conference had a link to the June 16th federal funds webinar. It has a lot more detail than what I'm going to cover today, obviously, but again, for all these different grant programs, I encourage you to go back and look at that if you haven't already. We've got extensive guidance posted on our webpage for all these grants, and then all of our folks are listed at the end of those guidance documents of who to contact to try to get assistance or more information. And again, continue to monitor any memos that come forward in the monthly financial report, just in case there's anything relevant there. So if that's not enough, let's talk about attendance. So obviously last year was a challenging year with the attendance reporting. We know that, when you create a special rule early on in the process and then you wonder, how's this going to go? We knew it was going to be messy, and it has been, but I appreciate your effort to work through all this with your software vendors to try to make this as straightforward as possible, even though clearly it's been a challenge, and we know that. Well, let's talk about what is available for this year. AMI was new last year, and it is available this year. So many of you have already got the approved AMI plans, and that's available for you for up to 36 hours. And closure related to the pandemic or contagious disease is an allowable use for your AMI hours, should you need to shut down a building or the district for a short period of time. So all the provisions that are there in the AMI statute are there still for this year. However, AMI X, that rule expired at the end of last week, so it is not available to us. We believe every student needs to have the opportunity to be full on site during this school year. Now with that, we know there are other options for folks. MOCAP is of course an option for a full-time virtual situation or even individual coursework. Or you might even have a district-offered version that meets the virtual statute. That 162.1250, there's 12 criteria in there, whether you offer the program yourself as a district or you have a partner service provider for that, that is an option for you as well. But gone are the hybrid and the intermittent blended type situations like we had last year. But what do we do about students in quarantines? We know there's going to be quarantines, and we know there may be significant numbers there. So we have within our attendance hour claiming guidance several options, and we've added one as recently as last week. A student who's under a COVID-19 quarantine is eligible under homebound. That's a qualifying condition. We put that in place last year. You have the traditional option of 5 hours of one-on-one direct instruction. That's an option that's been there for homebound, for the traditional homebound for a long time. I recognize that may not be the most practical situation for a lot of quantity of students that might be in quarantine. You also have the ability for a live remote participation through video linking, whether it's Google Meet or Zoom or whatever that might be. That is an option. That was actually in the guidance prior to COVID for homebound instruction. In that particular case, the amount of time they participate remotely is what you would count for attendance. And then on Friday, we added another choice, recognizing because of the numbers that you need the most flexibility possible. You can utilize your AMI methodology for students in quarantine on an individual student basis. So we're talking about working with an individual student or a small group of students or even a larger group of students, but not school-wide. So if in fact you want to serve your students through whatever you've already proposed and gotten approved as your AMI methodology, you can do that when they're under quarantine. Now, when you do that, if we're going to use the AMI provisions, you're using AMI attendance as well, which is assignment completion for those situations. So in the attendance hour document, if you go to the homebound section, there is a paragraph at the end of this that outlines all three of these options and how the attendance is counted. Our hope is that among these options, you have the flexibility to make sure, A, you can go ahead and serve those students, and B, you can count the attendance for that level of service. We want to make sure everybody gets that support, and we want to make sure you have the opportunity to get ADA attendance for that support. I know that's going to be a big challenge this year, but we want to try to provide you some flexibility in that regard. Moving on then, I want to talk a little bit about the emergency waivers that are still in place. We've got a list of 4 here that right now would expire August 31st unless the emergency order gets extended and the governor approves extension of the waivers as well. For most of you, the first two probably don't apply, but you might still be using your school buses to deliver meals to students who are virtual in your district, full-time virtual. That's an option for you, and if so, you can do that under this waiver. The one I think most of you are interested in are those last two about retirees coming back and work without the 550-hour limit. That is in place through August 31st. At this point, we don't know if the emergency order will get extended. We have requested, with the cooperation of PSRS peers, that these waivers be extended as well if we get the opportunity. And not knowing exactly how that's going to go, we know it's an issue, finding enough subs and using our retirees to help fill that gap. At whatever point during the year the waiver does expire, that's when the 550 count starts for this school year. So if that's August 31st, it starts September 1st. If it's December 31st, it starts January 1st. But if you think about it, if it happens to get extended 3 or 4 months, that probably buys us the rest of the year because the 550 won't start till after that. We don't know yet what's going to come. I think the data that we're seeing might indicate one way or another, but that's up to for others to make that decision. So I just want to kind of let you know how we think this is going to work. At whatever point in time the waiver ends, that's when the 550 clock starts. So just be aware of that. We will update you if it's extended. It will also let you know if it expires. Just a general calendar reminder that we no longer have a required number of days. You just have to meet 1,044 hours, and you have to plan 36 weather makeup hours. Hopefully you've done that already and you reported that in your calendar. I will point out that this 36 hours is separate and aside from your 36 AMI hours. If you utilize 36 AMI hours, those are counted as days that you're in session. The 36-hour weather makeup days are above and beyond that or separate from that. Back in late April, Tammy Lehman updated a very extensive calendar tracking document that's available on our website for you to track all your AMI days and your weather makeup days. So hopefully that will be a helpful tool for you. Again, we no longer have to track it by days per se. Here's our school finance team. This team really deals with the monthly payment, transmittals, the ASBRs, things of that sort. You'll notice a name missing here. Deborah Klink retired last week. You may not be aware of that, but obviously she's been the stalwart of school transportation in Missouri for 27 years. So that duty has been divided. David Trammell will take on the kind of the more technical terms of the transportation related requirements, and Tammy Lehman will take on the payment side of things. You see a familiar name back in the section. Sharon Bax has returned to school finance. We've redivided the districts according to the numbers you see up on the chart to kind of redistribute the workload since David and Tammy are taking on the transportation piece. So, we're thankful for Deborah's service. She's been a tremendous asset. We're going to miss her, but the team's ready to step up and continue to support you across the board. And obviously your finance folks are working on the ASBR now as we speak. Just a reminder that that's due August 15th. With that, I'm very proud of this team. I'm very proud of all of our folks at DESE that are working with all the federal relief programs. Dr. Neal and his support with all of this. He's really stepped up to take on some additional duties in this regard. I appreciate your work working through all this with us. I want to thank you for that work and appreciate your time with that. And if you have questions afterwards, Chris and I will be available. Thank you very much.